Okay, so now we have all this data. We collected hundreds of millions of data points. We pulled them in, we looked at averages, we looked at this. How do I calculate this cost per delivered gallon? How do I calculate the actual cost to run my business? How can I get to a number that is acceptable, that clients will understand, that prospects will understand, that companies will understand, that owners will understand, that managers will understand? How do I get there in a way that someone can look back and say, yes, that is my cost. That does make sense. We're going to come from a perspective of, we're using data, not opinions. We grabbed all this data, these 400 million gallons worth of data. We've broken it down by company into what their costs, how many trucks, how many gallons, etc. And then now we have to take all of this information, X number of trucks, X number of hours, how much you're spending on insurance, how much you're spending on this, how many stops you're making, and we have to convert it. So what we did is we started with this notion that not all the expenses that a company has are expenses that are going to be directly related to the delivery of fuels. Keep in mind, the goal here is to lower the delivery costs. Typically speaking, again, you have to check your own numbers and see what you're comfortable with, but about 70% of the costs that a company, 70% of the operational costs that a company has is the cost to deliver fuel. Pretty much their fuel delivery company, so that would make sense. We do not include rent or executive salaries or basically anything related to SG&A. These are just the costs. So again, we'll ask the question, because if we can't baseline this, we're not going to get anywhere. What costs are involved? What are the costs to actually make a delivery? So we have all the data about the number of stops, etc. But now let's look at costs. We broke down the costs into two ways. The first section of costs is just your fixed costs. So those costs we have, they're directly related to actually the vehicles for the most part, but we have to see what the impact of this cost is going to be. So we basically we spoke with leasing companies, finance companies, banks, owners, CFOs, etc. And if you add up the costs to own a truck, so it's the physical truck itself, whether owned or leased or depreciated, something's hitting your books. And you add to that the very expensive cost to insure that truck, and you add on the fact that somebody has to regularly maintain that truck, and then you have all these other little things. You have inspections, but basically it's the cost of ownership. Whether it's used or not, the cost of ownership generally comes out to somewhere in the area of about $5,000 a month or about $60,000 per year. Again, feel free to check your numbers. That's been the baseline that we're comfortable with, that we've discussed with people. It seems to, as they would say in the industry, it smells right. It's around what people see. It seems to make sense to people. So now I have fixed costs. If I own a truck, it costs $60,000. If I own 10 trucks, it costs $600,000 per year. If I own 100 trucks, it's $6 million a year of fixed costs, regardless of how many days those trucks are used. In addition to that, the other major component in devising the actual cost to make deliveries, well, you have variable costs. You have costs every time you dispatch, every time you send out a truck. So now what's in there? Well, first and foremost are your wages. Driver wages with an allocation towards your dispatchers. And we broke it down. Again, we asked the questions. It's not a perfect science depending upon where you are, but if you lop all together the cost of the driver, plus any and all benefits that he or she gets, plus an allocation, because for every X number of drivers there is a dispatcher, so you need an allocation for dispatcher. So the wages on that come out to somewhere all in about $55 an hour as we had calculated it. And so that's variable cost number one. You're not necessarily paying a wage if you didn't send someone out to deliver. If you don't need a driver, well, you might not have a driver. So this is a variable cost. The trucks, great as they are and as important as they are, they're only getting 4 or 5 miles to the gallon. If you take a look at costs, obviously fuel costs have gone down in the last few months, but you're probably looking at spending somewhere around 50 cents, maybe as high as 60 cents just to drive a mile. It's not a good thing or a bad thing. Every time you drive a mile, you're driving towards making some money, but it's a cost and it's a variable cost. And then you have this other. You still have to replace tires, there's still washer fluid, there's still unplanned little fender benders and things that you have to get fixed. But if you add all them up, if you take this major one being the $55 an hour and you multiply it by 9 hours, almost $500, and you add all the smaller ones for the fuel, etc., you're probably spending in the area of $600 to dispatch a truck. So if you want to go high level and just see, where we can start having a conversation, it should cost you somewhere around $60,000 to have a truck, regardless of how many days it's used over the course of the year. We want to optimize how many days it's used. The more days you can use, maybe the fewer trucks that you need. And we also have to realize that dispatching a truck has an expense to it, has a cost to it. It's not just, hey, I have the truck, what's the difference? I'll use as much as I want. It's not as simple as that, because your driver's wages, all of that, it'll cost you $600 to send it out. So now I have the two major components as far as the cost to deliver fuel. I have fixed costs, which you described. I have variable costs. But in your mind, if you want to get some sort of comfort level, $60,000 a year to own the truck, $600 to dispatch the truck. That's our next step in this process.